I did my undergraduate and graduate work here in the University of Missouri back in the 80s, and when I came out, I'd done my master's work on shorebirds, migratory shorebirds, and when I came out of there, I took a job on the East Coast right off the get-go, working for Manomet Bird Observatory, and I worked for a group called the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Well, during that time, I'd spent a lot of time working with wetland managers and building partnerships, working with migratory shorebirds and trying to integrate shorebirds into wetland and waterfowl management practices way back when. And that sort of got me started on working with more on public lands than on private lands at the time. And so I worked with a lot of wetland managers across the country, a lot of different state and Fish and Wildlife Service refuge managers. Well, after that job finished up, then I came to Missouri after the Great Flood of '93 and worked as a coordinator for a very large research project with at the time Soil Conservation Service and the Missouri Department of Conservation. And we were looking at soil. We had a lot of damage that occurred along the Missouri River and a lot of new wetlands that were created due to scouring and different actions of the flood. And so we were just wanting to try to evaluate sort of how wetlands developed along the floodplain after a major event. And we had about 50 to 60 sites that we were doing this on. Well, most all of this was on private ground. And so I was the main contact between the researchers and the private landowners. And so I spent a lot of face time working with landowners, trying to, one, convince them to let us on their property and do this work. And, it was going to be a 4-year study, so it was going to go on for a number of years. And so that really kind of got me spending a lot more time in the private sector, of working with landowners, not so much on public land. And then after that sort of started to wrap up, then I was still, now the switch had come over between the Soil Conservation Service and Natural Resources Conservation Service. And at that time, then I was a wetland biologist for them. And so by doing that, WRP was really getting going at the time. And so I was doing a lot of work with doing sign-ups and doing restorations for WRP. And so that time starting to work with a lot of private landowners, working with them through the whole sign-up process, talking to them about the restorations, what we were going to do, those types of things. And so as that sort of transitioned, then I became the wetland team leader for NRCS, for the wetland team in Northwest Missouri, working with a great bunch of folks, and we were doing WRP work. Well, did that for about 6 years. And knew about the Partners program. I knew Kelly. Kelly and I went to school together, all through undergrad and grad school. So we'd known each other for years, knew what she was doing. She was state coordinator down here. We ran a few Partners projects through our office up in Chillicothe. We were doing a lot of small wetland work that wasn't really, it wasn't really suited for WRP, but was great for the Partners program. So we were kind of partnering with Kelly, and Mike McClure especially did a lot of those projects, and I'd help out on them. And then an old friend of mine, Jim Munson, was a state coordinator in Iowa, and Jim and I had interacted out in Massachusetts many, many years ago and knew each other and continued to know each other when he was state coordinator in Iowa. Well, he retired. And out of the blue, one day I was driving my federal truck back from a wetland somewhere, and Munson called me up and said, "Hey, I'm just retired and you need to apply for my job as state coordinator in Iowa." And I said, "Why would I want to do that, Jim? I'm doing all this great WRP work. This is wonderful down here." He goes, "It's the best job in the Fish and Wildlife Service." And he was right.
Ready?
So that's a great question, and I really put it all on my grandfather, Levengood. He had me out from, the time, my dad and I fished a lot too, don't get me wrong. We did do a lot of fishing, but my dad didn't hunt much, or at all really. But my grandfather hunted, and he grew up, child of the Depression, like a lot of people did, our grandfathers did, and so he, you know, he was good at hunting, and I was tagging along from the time I can almost remember, getting out in the outdoors and, you know, rabbit hunting, squirrel hunting, and finally I get old enough I could deer hunt and got my own first 410 and all that, and I was really big in the outdoors, and we did a lot of fishing also, and so that went, you know, pretty much through my childhood. Well, I was getting a little bit older, and I didn't go to college right away. I was an auto body man and was a mechanic for several years before I decided to go to college. And my grandfather got cancer, and he was dying, and he and I were sitting on a riverbank fishing, and he said, you know, you really ought to do something about this. He says, we're gonna lose a lot of this in someday, you know, with all the development and taking out all the fence rows and all that kind of stuff. And he goes, you really ought to try to think about getting into conservation.
So this, we'll end on this with, explain this photo. What's going on here?
So this was in 1989 at Cheyenne Bottoms, Kansas. And I was doing my graduate work on migratory shorebirds. Well, if you see in the backdrop, there looks like, oh, you know, a big square. Well, anyway, that was a bird exclosure. So we would have to go out every day during a certain amount of time period and collect benthic samples from that exclosure. And so we were looking at invertebrate densities inside the exclosure and outside the exclosure to try to determine how many chironomid shorebirds were eating at the time. Well, it was a pretty long walk out there, and, you know, you didn't want to have chest waders on. Well, there was a borrow ditch that was about 20 feet wide that was about 8 feet deep. And once you got across the borrow ditch, then you were in about, you know, 4 inches of water, which is less, which is where the shorebirds were. So we came up with this little contraption of throwing it in the back of the truck, and it was just an inner tube and a paddle and a piece of plywood, and we would paddle ourselves across the borrow ditch, go get our samples, come back, paddle back, do the whole thing 8 more times. So it was lighter than a canoe, and it got us across the borrow ditch.